buenos días a todos. Quiero darles la bienvenida al ciclo de webinars Mercados de Carbono para la Acción y Ambición Climática en América Latina. El cambio climático es uno de los mayores desafíos de la humanidad. Todos sufrimos sus efectos, pero lo cierto es que los más vulnerables son los más afectados. La ciencia nos ha dicho que la ventana de oportunidad para enfrentar sus impactos catastróficos se está cerrando rápidamente. Por eso debemos redoblar nuestros esfuerzos para combatir el cambio climático, porque la esperanza de un mejor futuro depende de un planeta saludable. El gobierno de los Estados Unidos ha tomado la firme decisión de ser un líder en el esfuerzo global para encontrar una solución. Por eso luchar contra el cambio climático es uno de los pilares de la agenda Build Back Better o Reconstruir Mejor de la administración del presidente Biden. En la medida que avancemos en este sentido, desde la Agencia de los Estados Unidos para el Desarrollo Internacional, USAID, nos sentimos orgullosos de acompañar el liderazgo que han ejercido los gobiernos, las comunidades rurales y el sector privado para reducir las emisiones de carbono, generando oportunidades económicas sostenibles y desarrollo social. Reconociendo que existen múltiples herramientas para mitigar el cambio climático, hoy nos convoca la oportunidad que representan los mercados de carbono, no solo para alcanzar reducciones significativas y eficientes en las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, sino también para promover el desarrollo de las economías locales y de comunidades que participan en dichos mercados. Quiero darles un ejemplo de los logros que los mercados de carbono han generado en Colombia. 19 comunidades afrocolombianas e indígenas de la región del Pacífico han visto sus esfuerzos de conservación recompensados. A pesar de enfrentar décadas de violencia y una larga historia de desigualdad, las comunidades se han unido para evitar la deforestación, protegiendo más de 500,000 hectáreas de bosque. Con el apoyo de USAID, las comunidades han generado créditos de carbono que se comercializan en mercados nacionales e internacionales gracias a la regulación favorable del gobierno de Colombia. Los ingresos generados por la venta de dichos créditos son invertidos en escuelas, puestos de salud y el desarrollo comunitario de más de 10,000 familias en una de las zonas más vulnerables del país. El objetivo del ciclo de webinars que hoy lanzamos es justamente compartir experiencias de los gobiernos, del sector privado y de las comunidades de América Latina en el diseño, implementación y participación en mercados de carbono nacional e internacional. Invitamos a todos los panelistas a compartir sus aprendizajes, sus retos y perspectivas para el desarrollo de los mercados de carbono en América Latina. Nos interesa mucho conocer sus reflexiones sobre la importancia que este instrumento tiene para acelerar el cumplimiento de los compromisos nacionales frente al Acuerdo de París y alcanzar otros objetivos apremiantes de desarrollo social y económico en nuestra región. Bienvenidos.
Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible estamos muy complacidos de apoyar, junto a la Agencia de Estados Unidos para el Desarrollo Internacional USAID, esta serie de webinars informativos que darán a conocer las generalidades de los mercados de carbono en Colombia. En el marco de la urgencia por contrarrestar el cambio climático, Colombia se ha comprometido a través de su NDC a lograr una reducción de 51% de sus emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero para el año 2030 en el marco del Acuerdo de París. En consonancia con nuestro compromiso de carbono neutralidad en el 2050, en 2030 limitaremos nuestras emisiones para no superar un techo de 169.4 millones de toneladas de carbono equivalente a la atmósfera. Este compromiso está técnicamente sustentado y obedece al llamado urgente de la ciencia para actuar decididamente en este sentido. Esperamos también que se sigan sumando muchas medidas, razón por la cual nos encontramos en un ejercicio de articulación de actores, territorios del sector privado, para sumar cada vez más actores a la implementación de la NDC. Para cumplir con este ambicioso objetivo de mitigación, el país ha considerado la aplicación de varias medidas que buscan reducir o incentivar la reducción de sus emisiones, entre las cuales se destaca la adopción de mecanismos de fijación de precios de carbono, tales como el impuesto a carbono y los sistemas de comercio de emisiones. Cabe mencionar que la adopción de dichos mecanismos ha sido incluida en instrumentos normativos, como la Ley 1819, que creó, de hecho, el impuesto al carbono, y la Ley 1931, que también se conoce como la Ley de Cambio Climático en Colombia. En ella se estableció la creación del Programa de Cupos Transables de Emisiones y el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo 2018-2022, Pacto por Colombia, Pacto por la Equidad, que definió objetivos específicos en este sentido. En los 4 años que ha estado en funcionamiento el impuesto al carbono, empezando en 2017, nos ha demostrado lo importante que son los mercados de carbono para la transición del país hacia la carbono neutralidad y hacia el cumplimiento de nuestra NDC. Uno de los principales objetivos al adoptar y potenciar este tipo de instrumentos es el incentivar la mitigación al generar una demanda de reducción de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero y unas condiciones para crear una oferta de estas. Al final, lo que se logra es un esquema de intercambio de resultados de mitigación en términos de toneladas de CO2 equivalente, que se conocen como bonos de carbono y que configuran lo que se conoce hoy como un mercado de carbono. Es por ello que deseamos compartir avances nacionales e internacionales en materias de mercados y retos y oportunidades que estos tienen, y a todo tipo de público, de tal forma que haya apropiación y acción. Esperamos contar con la participación del sector privado, del sector público, de la academia y de la sociedad civil. Finalmente, quiero resaltar que es muy importante, clave, la apropiación y la acción. Esta tarea no es solo del gobierno nacional. Los diferentes sectores, el sector privado, el sector académico, la ciudadanía, pueden implementar medidas y cambios en sus actividades diarias para facilitar la transición hacia una economía baja en carbono. Un país adaptado y con capacidad de responder los efectos del cambio climático es el compromiso que tenemos en el gobierno y esperamos que tengan todos los colombianos. Muchas gracias.
Sean todos bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Ana Milena Plata Fajardo, soy presidente de Carbono, Asociación Colombiana de Actores de Mercado de Carbono. Es un gusto contar con la participación de más de 900 personas conectadas al primero de 4 webinars que se estarán presentando en el marco de la cooperación entre USAID, AIETA, Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible y Carbono. Hoy hablaremos de cómo el mercado de carbono privado contribuye al cumplimiento de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible y al compromiso de país en las NDCs. Es muy emocionante para todos los que estamos involucrados en el sector contemplar cómo la reglamentación colombiana robusta ha permitido el desarrollo de un mercado de carbono eficiente y de ejemplo para nuestros países vecinos latinoamericanos. En esta serie de webinars esperamos compartir con ustedes la idea de cómo los certificados de emisiones o créditos de carbono impulsan verdaderos cambios locales en relación con el fortalecimiento de la gobernanza de comunidades étnicas, la reforestación, la tecnificación de la infraestructura, entre otros. Para empezar a hablar de NDCs, hay 2 cifras que debemos tener en cuenta. La primera corresponde a la meta de disminución del 51% frente al escenario línea base al 2030. La segunda es la meta de disminuir la tasa de deforestación a 50.000 hectáreas año. Recordemos que la tasa de deforestación de hoy es de aproximadamente 160.000 hectáreas por año. Es aquí donde entra a jugar un papel importante las comunidades étnicas, el cual toma cada vez más relevancia en Colombia. Hoy, el 32% de las tierras boscosas en el país pertenece a comunidades negras y resguardos indígenas, y es en sus territorios donde se debe implementar estas acciones. Para complementar un poco las cifras, quisiera recalcar que además de las 19 comunidades afrocolombianas y resguardos indígenas que apoya USAID, localizadas en 500.000 hectáreas, en Colombia hay otras 30 comunidades afrocolombianas e indígenas apoyadas directamente por inversión privada directa. Desde Asocarbono estimamos que gracias al financiamiento de la USAID y inversionistas privados se protegen cerca de 4 millones de hectáreas de bosque en el país. Esta cifra no solo equivale a la reducción de emisiones de deforestación y degradación forestal, representa también una fuente de financiamiento climático significativa. Y ahora quiero enfatizar en el financiamiento climático, ya que en este momento Colombia está enfrentando un tercer pico de pandemia y afronta una dificultad mayor en la creación de nuevas fuentes de empleo y solvencia económica. Es por ello que el mercado de carbono financiado por regulaciones como la no causación del impuesto al carbono, pero también por el incremento a la demanda de compensación voluntaria, logra apalancar el desarrollo de las regiones boscosas de la Colombia profunda y también apalancar innovaciones tecnológicas de energías no convencionales. Siento que todos los que participamos en este webinar somos conscientes de ello y me alegra saber que de aquí a 10 años el mercado de carbono será una de las historias de mayor éxito en la reactivación de la economía post-pandemia. Asimismo, esta es una gran oportunidad para que empresas y ciudadanos que no han hecho uso del mecanismo de compensación de huella de carbono se vinculen en este mercado, de tal forma que puedan ayudar a proteger las selvas tropicales y otros ecosistemas críticos, mejorar los medios de vida de las personas más vulnerables, comunidades étnicas y acelerar la implementación de nuevas tecnologías energéticas. Muchas gracias.
My name is Dirk Forrester, and I'm pleased to be with you. I'm joining you from the States, and it's great to see such a large group of interest in future of carbon market. For IETA, Latin America holds a lot of promise because we see a rise in interest in use of carbon pricing systems. And we know that in order to reach the levels inspired by the Paris Climate Agreement of reducing emissions to net zero level that preserve the global warming of our planet to no more than 2 degrees and hopefully only 1.5 degrees, that level of action is going to require a level of cooperation and investment that we've never seen before. We've looked at a lot of economic analysis about pathways for achieving net zero emissions. And one of the lessons we've learned is that there are 3 essential elements for getting there. One is that the private sector and the public sector need to come together around solutions that can really inspire business to innovate and to invest at scale. That requires carbon pricing, and AIDA is a proud member of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition that the World Bank has helped to organize, and we collaborate with a number of governments, including the government of Colombia and the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. The second piece that's really essential is to understand that ultimately emissions are going to have to come down to a level of net zero, not zero, but net zero. And what the net means is that any remaining emissions are going to be compensated with the same amount of removals. Removals of carbon from the atmosphere can take place in a number of ways, through improved agricultural practices, as is being explored in Colombia, through improved forestry projects, which we'll be talking about today, or improved forest management and reforestation, which can pull more carbon out of the air and store it in our forests. And of course, technological opportunities as well for using engineered solutions that can do what a tree does of sucking carbon out of the air and storing it permanently. So removals are going to play an important role in the future. And then finally, cooperation through markets that can across international borders. We think that's going to be essential for us as humanity achieving net zero emissions. That means that the pioneering efforts that Colombia has underway could be workable for other countries, but could also lay a pathway for cooperation across borders where emission removals could be brought to market on a global basis and attract investment into good removal practices. This ability to connect markets internationally is one of our highest priorities in AIDA, because we're serious about getting to net zero emissions. And to get to net zero, you have to have markets that connect across borders. This is an important topic in this year because international negotiators are working on the rules for accounting for cooperation for transfers of units across borders. This is the work of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And our hope is that Colombia can join with other leaders across Latin America to help us get good rules agreed this year so that more market connections can happen in the future. There's nothing stopping countries across the region from going forward with their own cooperative approaches, either domestically or internationally. It's been encouraging to see Peru enter an agreement with Switzerland that lays out a pathway for cooperation between those two countries. But that's just the tip of the iceberg on what the potential is, because as I said, we need to scale up the amount of investment, and that's going to require good market incentives, good pricing signals, and international market cooperation that recognizes the role of natural climate solutions. It's a delight for AIDA to collaborate with our friends at Carbono. So thanks, Ana Milena, for being here. Also with our friends at USAID. And I hope that all of you will get a lot out of this workshop today. And thank you for attending. Muchas gracias.
Good morning, everyone. And I just want to start by saying how excited I am to be on the line this morning at this important webinar with scientists, policymakers, economists, activists, private sector leaders. It really is great to be here. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to open this strategic set of webinars on the growing use of carbon markets and carbon pricing in Latin American countries. I want to greet and thank the organizers at the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA. I want to greet Colombia's Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, of course, the Colombian Association of Carbon Market Actors, Carbono, our teams at USAID, what we call DDI, and certainly our Colombia mission. Great to see Martha Ponte on the line this morning. Thank you so much for organizing this very timely event. This set of 4 webinars will build on the momentum of President Biden's climate summit last week and will lead a robust public-private discussion to help map out the road to COP26 at Glasgow in November. At USAID, we know that we really don't have a minute to waste. And there really are no more important and no more empowered audiences than the private and public sector leaders that we've had, we've invited to these webinars. At USAID, we also believe in the power of markets and the importance of engaging the private sector as key development partners in everything we do, including tackling the climate crisis. This is why we've supported market-based alternatives, such as our BioRed projects in Colombia's magnificent Pacific forests, which have slowed deforestation by thousands of hectares per year. And it is in recognition of the power of the market to drive change that we've supported the implementation of Colombia's carbon tax and helped to design the regulatory structure of that country's domestic carbon market. We salute Colombia's leadership today. We need to harness the power of the private sector in partnership with governments and civil society to achieve meaningful progress in the climate crisis, what is arguably the most pressing global challenge of our times. The US government joined the road back to progress when President Biden recommitted the United States to the Paris Climate Accord on the first day of his administration. In just a few short months, the US has taken decisive action. President Biden named John Kerry as special climate envoy, and he convened 40 heads of state, representatives of the indigenous communities, youth leaders, and the private sector at the Climate Summit on the 22nd of April, the largest virtual meeting of its kind the world has seen, demonstrating the central importance of the climate crisis to both our domestic and foreign policy agendas. It was a motivating event and truly heartening to hear the strong supporting positions from leaders from around the globe and across the Latin America and Caribbean region, including the presidents of Jamaica, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. But going forward, it's important to the United States and for countries and private sector companies all over the world to travel down that road with humility, commitment, and greater ambition. Humility also in knowing that for all our industrial capacity, the United States is responsible for only 15% of global emissions. The whole world really must come together to solve this problem. No one country can do it alone. And humility in knowing that today, no country and no continent is getting the job done. Not yet. At the COP in November, all nations must raise ambition together, or we'll all fail together. Failure, however, as we know, is not an option. As climate envoy Kerry has often stated, success means tapping into the best of our collective ingenuity, creativity, and diplomacy, from brain power to alternative energy power, using every tool we have to get where we need to go. Success means lifting up communities long left behind and creating an equitable recovery. Success means ensuring economic efficiency in our mitigation programs, and it means leading our key sectors in the process. The road ahead's challenging, but it's also an exciting prospect as we green and transform our economies. It means creating millions of middle-class jobs. It means less pollution in our air and in our oceans. It means making life healthier for citizens across the world. It means the creation of new markets, such as the markets for cost-effective mitigation services. Technological innovation is now in our favor, but the governments, policymakers, financial entities, and private sector producers can and must be in the lead if we're to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. For all of us working on the climate front, it's clear that cleaning up greenhouse gas emissions from our economic production can be a win-win proposition. Just a few examples to make this point. Globally, the cheapest new electric power plant one can install is based on renewables, which explains why it now makes up more than 70% new capacity. South America, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Brazil are moving quickly to transform their energy sectors with massive private sector investments in solar and wind generation projects. The highest valued auto company in the world today only makes electric zero emission vehicles. We see Latin America's clean energy systems positioned to lead the world in the transition to electric mobility with major reductions in CO2 emissions. Carbon pricing and markets can lead new investments toward clean technologies, such as the zero emission steel plant that is now being built in Austria, where emissions are subject to cap and trade carbon markets. We are seeing carbon capture and storage becoming more cost effective, and with carbon pricing in its favor, it can now become a reality sooner. For example, a cement plant in Norway that anticipates capturing and storing all its CO2 by 2030. And green economies will generate new jobs. The European Union anticipates 2 million additional jobs with the green economy growing under its carbon market, the EU emission trading system. Here in the US, prior to the outset and disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, we experienced 5 years of steady growth in clean energy employment, with over 3.3 million new workers put into jobs across our country. In India, the country has seen a 5-fold increase in clean energy jobs over the same period, demonstrating the opportunities that green growth can create. But we need to all move together. We need to collectively focus on the steep reductions needed to meet the goal of limiting temperature change to 1.5 degrees in order to avert catastrophic damage. Well-designed and organized carbon markets offer huge opportunities for businesses, industrialists, energy producers, farmers, and forestry specialists to create clean green jobs and economic growth, and to use President Biden's words, to accelerate green investment and to lower our emissions trajectories. We know we need to phase out coal 5 times faster than we have been. We need to increase tree cover 5 times faster. We need to ramp up renewable energy 6 times faster. We need to transition to electric vehicles at a rate 22 times faster. And we need to bring tropical deforestation to a halt by 2030. Carbon pricing and carbon markets can help us do that. Reaching net zero global carbon emissions as early as possible will take a wholesale transformation of the global economy. At the climate summit, many presidents indicated the need to shift this goal from 2050 to 2030. And the success of that transformation will depend in large part on efficient pricing of carbon emissions and on the structuring and functioning of efficient markets. Efficient markets make clean production more profitable and make emission-intensive production less competitive. But we need leadership from public policymakers and the private sector alike. The good news, it's the economic opportunity of many lifetimes. We're looking at an unprecedented wealth creation opportunity. Since 2015, when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, solar and wind power have doubled their share of global electricity to 10%. In most countries in the world, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil-fueled power plants. Global investment in new clean power capacity is set to exceed $10 trillion through mid-century, more than 6 times the investment in dirtier options. Other clean energy sectors, from greenhouse hydrogen to electric vehicles, could also represent multi-trillion-dollar markets in the decades to come. Here's the challenge. Clean energy gets cheaper, but a net zero transition will become more complex, requiring greater leadership everywhere. It won't be enough to merely keep deploying more clean energy. Major economies around the world will need to design and execute tailored roadmaps to overhaul their own energy systems. For the market-based economies of the Americas, the introduction of carbon pricing and efficient carbon markets are needed to provide clear price signals to project developers, investors, and the economic systems at large. As our host, the International Emissions Trading Association, has shown us over the years, we'll need to collaborate on carbon pricing in emissions-intensive sectors that cross borders, aviation, shipping, heavy industry, power, and more, to chart a path to deep decarbonization in each. Governments have an important role to play in galvanizing net zero transitions, and carbon markets can be a significant element of the policy toolkit. Markets can lead investment in developing countries by identifying the least cost paths to compliance and mitigation towards the cleaner technologies, and markets can reward innovators. Carbon market design and development allows governments to partner intimately with the private sector, which brings expertise in every corner of the economy, substantial capacity to invest in new infrastructure, and the ingenuity and drive to bring new innovations to market. The Biden administration is optimistic that we can get there. Sustainable investment funds surpassed $1 trillion for the first time on record. And the boom in environmental, social, and corporate governance investing is only beginning as fund inflows quadrupled in 2020. Venture capital investments in innovative technologies to combat climate change also surged to a record high in 2020. These are positive trends, but challenges remain. In order to transition to a clean energy economy and to do so rapidly, we need to develop and scale new and improved technologies. Even though a handful of clean energy technologies such as solar and wind power are now cost competitive with fossil fuels, most aren't. The International Energy Agency warns that 42 of 46 critical clean energy technologies aren't yet on track, and roughly half of the carbon emissions reductions needed for a swift net zero transition will need to come from energy technologies that have not even reached commercial markets yet. This means we have a big job ahead of us, and we must spur even greater innovation. Appropriate price signals can help us in this regard and can be instrumental in driving innovation. The good news is we're seeing growing interest in price mechanisms, as this program of webinars will demonstrate. We can solve this challenge as we have so many others by working together through effective policy planning, efficient regulation, and the appropriate use of markets to guide investment towards low emissions alternatives in the productive sphere. Across energy storage, advanced mobility, next generation renewable and other clean power technologies, clean industrial processes, zero carbon fuels, smart systems, carbon capture, and more, we stand at the precipice of a rare opportunity to create new technologies and new markets. The countries that make it a strategic priority to foster these markets and industries will not only help reduce emissions both within and outside their borders, they'll also reap the economic rewards of powering the global economic transformation. In Colombia, as has been noted, USAID is supporting the government, the private sector, and communities to consolidate its market for domestic carbon credits. Since the adoption of a favorable regulation in 2016, the Colombia carbon market has traded more than 36 million tons of carbon, which provide finance for clean energy and to fight deforestation. Colombia is a forest country, so it's no surprise that most of those carbon credits correspond to the efforts of rural communities, Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, to protect their forests and adopt sustainable livelihoods, also helping the fight against illicit activities. The Colombian carbon market is fostering the participation and innovation from the private actors in other sectors such as energy and industry, accelerating the energy transformation that country is addressing. It is progressing in its quest to establish a complementary cap and trade system. The Colombian experience can be of great use in other Latin American countries, eager to accelerate the implementation of their climate goals and to green their economies. In the United States, to compensate for the lack of national carbon dioxide regulation, a dozen states have initiated their own regulations, alone or in conjunction with others. In January 2013, California officially launched its comprehensive cap and trade program, while 9 states in the Northeast region of the US continue to participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a carbon trading program aimed at the power sector. The Canadian province of Quebec joined forces with California to form a cross-border market in January 2014, while Alberta continues to press forward with its carbon reduction program, and British Columbia remains committed to its pioneering carbon tax and carbon neutral government program. Pacific Coast neighbors, British Columbia, California, Oregon, and Washington have also joined forces to take on the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the region, with Oregon and Washington possibly adopting a price on carbon pollution as part of this initiative, known as the Pacific Coast Collaborative. We at USAID are firmly committed to mitigating climate change. We hope that this set of 4 webinars can encourage a robust discussion on the role of carbon markets and how each nation can appropriately design carbon pricing and carbon markets throughout the hemisphere. You can be assured that the new administration is firmly committed to leading and supporting on this front. So now, with humility and ambition, let's get to work to make it a reality on the road to Glasgow and on the road to net zero, the road to defeating the climate crisis and leaving our kids a world that is prosperous, healthy, and secure. Thank you.
Buen día. Realmente celebro esta serie de webinars que nos va a permitir en América Latina fortalecer capacidades al conocer otras experiencias. Sobre todo porque los países de América Latina que ya entregaron su actualización de compromisos determinados nacionalmente, todos han incluido el NDC de transición energética. Así que lo que vamos a conocer, lo que ya hemos escuchado de los que han presentado y lo que vamos a conocer en este panel nos va a ser de mucha utilidad. Por ejemplo, en el caso de Panamá, las mayores emisiones las tenemos justamente en el sector energía, pero fundamentalmente en transporte. Tenemos compromisos muy ambiciosos en la transición energética de reducción del 24% de las emisiones. Pero Panamá se caracteriza también porque es carbono negativo, como lo hemos evidenciado en el segundo informe bienal que en el mes de febrero entregamos a la Convención de Cambio Climático. Nuestra mayor preocupación es que justamente tenemos una gran cobertura boscosa, todavía tenemos capacidad de restaurar tierras degradadas e incrementar cobertura boscosa. En este momento ya estamos aportando en la captura global de emisiones de 38%. Podemos aportar aún más, pero aún así nos hemos puesto de meta reducir emisiones no solamente en la transición energética, también en el compromiso del sector agropecuario. Hemos lanzado recientemente el programa Reduce tu Huella Corporativo, que es el primer paso para el diseño de nuestro mercado de carbono, que ya trabajamos en eso con asesoría del Banco Mundial. Estamos ya en la reducción de emisiones corporativas, diseñando sistemas de compensación para luego establecer el sistema de transacción de emisiones. Esperamos que el mercado panameño esté oficialmente operando en la Bolsa de Valores de Panamá el próximo año. Así que esta experiencia para nosotros es importantísima y lo que vamos a conocer de las presentaciones de los panelistas va a ser de muchísima utilidad, como les dije, para nuestro país y para el resto de los países. En esa gran cobertura boscosa que tenemos hay también mucha pobreza. Se caracteriza por una inequidad muy grande de los que viven dentro de nuestros bosques y alrededor de nuestros bosques. El mercado de carbono es una real oportunidad que nos permite mejorar las condiciones de vida haciendo inclusión social. Al nosotros hacer economía verde y tener éxito en la economía verde local, esa economía verde va a impactar luego la macroeconomía y nos va a permitir mejorar nuestro desarrollo económico, que sea un desarrollo sostenible e inclusivo, bajo en emisiones y resiliente al cambio climático. Entonces tenemos tres excelentes panelistas el día de hoy. Le paso la palabra, la oportunidad de presentar a Mariano Morazano. Él justamente es el jefe de políticas de transición energética para la región de América Latina de ENEL. Bienvenido, Mariano.
Hola, gracias, Ligia. Buenos días a todos los participantes. Antes de nada, agradecer a USAID, IETA, Azocarbono y Ministro de Ambiente por la invitación sobre un tema que evidentemente me apasiona como experto, habiendo trabajado en este tema también en el gobierno italiano hace muchos años y hace muchos años colaborando con IETA y también en los países de Latinoamérica para implementar sistemas de precio. Tenía una breve presentación que no veo. Muchas gracias. Podemos seguir con la próxima, por favor. Rápidamente, esto solo para recordar que el Grupo Enel es una empresa eléctrica italiana, pero que opera entre dos países y tiene sus activos en generación renovable, en redes inteligentes y con más de 70 usuarios y clientes finales. Y con esto confirmar que estamos trabajando en la dirección de la transición energética y la mitigación del cambio climático. Al siguiente, por favor. De otro lado, ya que hablamos también de Objetivos de Desarrollo Sustentable, recordar que en el mismo está comprometida con respetar estos objetivos y contribuir a lograrlos, y activamente trabajamos en 4 de ellos. Recuerdo aquí el 7 y el 13 sobre energía limpia y cambio climático, y también los objetivos en el que se ha puesto, según los Science Based Targets Initiative, y tenemos un compromiso a ser carbono neutrales en 2050. Siguiente, por favor. Siguiente, por favor. Siguiente, por favor. Antes de hablar de precio de carbono, hoy se ha recordado otros speakers antecedentes, que es un tema de cómo lograr cumplir los objetivos del Acuerdo de París y la transición energética en nuestro caso. Y acá solo recordar que en todos sus segmentos de negocio está dirigida en esta dirección. Trabajamos sobre las renovables, trabajamos sobre redes inteligentes para que el flujo de renovables aumente a los usos finales, y nos concentramos ahora también en la movilidad eléctrica y en la infraestructura urbana. Así que todo el negocio está alineado con los objetivos del Acuerdo de París. Siguiente, por favor. Y en la misma necesidad también ver que no solo cumplimos con nuestro negocio, tratamos de contribuir a los objetivos, también colaboramos con los gobiernos activamente en unos proyectos que se llaman hojas de ruta de transición energética, en los cuales tratamos, trabajando con stakeholders, de acelerar la transición energética a nivel nacional, apoyando marcos regulatorios transparentes y al mismo tiempo promoviendo mecanismos de financiación climática y de mercado del carbono, de lo cual hablamos hoy, haciendo escenarios y trabajando con grupos de interés. Acá tienen un ejemplo. Este es un informe del proyecto que hicimos con Colombia en 2019 con la Universidad de los Andes y con el apoyo también del gobierno y muchos stakeholders. Siguiente, por favor. Siguiente, por favor. Bueno, y el precio del carbono, como en él, siempre disfrutamos y explotamos y valorizamos el uso del instrumento de carbono, y pensamos en este momento sea más importante que nunca seguir utilizándolo, y no es solo una opinión nuestra. Acá simplifico lo que vemos como los trends, los drivers que están empujando siempre más en los países los instrumentos de precio de carbono. Obviamente contribuir a la implementación de la NDC con los varios tipos de instrumentos de carbono para que la transición sea más costo eficiente, pero también un tema de mercado energético, de reformas fiscales que también están alineadas con la NDC y que necesitan evidentemente el mecanismo de precio de carbono para un sistema energético eficiente, pero también descarbonizado. Y en último, siempre más importante, que también tenemos operadores financieros a nivel nacional e internacional que también piden la implementación del precio de carbono en las empresas y en los mercados para un tema de disminuir los riesgos de las inversiones y la estabilidad de los países. Siguiente, por favor. Acá solo para recordar con 2 puntos el contexto internacional. De un lado tenemos muchos operadores agentes, World Bank, Fondo Monetario Internacional, acá yo nombro la OECD, que nombran y sugieren la implementación de los precios de carbono. Acá algunos simples elementos, como evidentemente tener una visión a largo plazo en implementar el precio de carbono, pero al mismo tiempo fijar un precio explícito o también acompañarlo con precios implícitos según la condición de cada país. Y evidentemente también tener en cuenta los posibles impactos de los precios del carbono para, evidentemente, complementar con medidas complementarias y disminuir los efectos. Acá muestro solamente también el precio del ETS en Europa para mostrar una experiencia de largo plazo que tuvo también momentos difíciles. Se ha trabajado con la Comisión Europea y con los operadores privados para implementar este tema, para mejorarlo, y vemos los resultados. El precio ha subido, parece funcionar. Al mismo tiempo también se han utilizado en el pasado y se van a volver a utilizar otros instrumentos de flexibilidad como los carbon offsets. Siguiente, por favor. Y esto solo para recordar que en Latinoamérica tenemos una situación similar. No es una opinión nuestra, un sector privado, sino que los gobiernos latinoamericanos se están comprometiendo a través de la alianza también a implementar sistemas de precios de carbono lo más posibles coherentes, alineados para ser posiblemente integrados en el futuro. Siguiente, por favor. Y esto es para recordar que también nos apoyamos en un proyecto con un consultor internacional, Perspectives, para estudiar cuál podría ser la implementación del sistema de comercio en Latinoamérica. Trabajamos con los gobiernos de Chile, Colombia y Perú, y para ver cómo los instrumentos, el ETS y los offsets pueden contribuir a la implementación de la NDC en estos países, cómo evidentemente facilitar una implementación que sea nacional, pero también regional, y al mismo tiempo cómo alinear esto al artículo 6 del Acuerdo de París. O sea, cómo estos temas también pueden después integrarse en un mercado global internacional. Siguiente, por favor. Bueno, este proyecto dio varios resultados que yo acá sintetizo por un motivo de tiempo, pero es muy importante es que claramente tenemos unos instrumentos como el impuesto al carbono, que está aplicando hoy en día, los offset, y mañana se podrá implementar un sistema de transacción como un emission trading, pero es importante tener en cuenta que cada país es distinto, entonces hay que tener en cuenta las características nacionales en la secuencia de los instrumentos. Después agregar que obviamente es muy importante implementar artículo 6, como recordaba Dick Forrester recién, para tener después mercados que funcionan a nivel internacional, y evidentemente también el resultado es que la eficiencia económica de estos mercados mejoran con los sistemas de precio al carbono. Colombia, como sabemos, ya tiene un importante marco legal. Chile y Perú están haciendo algo similar, así que seguramente el ejemplo colombiano ha sido útil. Y recordar también que el sistema de comercio de emisiones, para poder ser implementado, tiene que ser suficientemente grande para ser líquido, así que sería importante en este sentido dibujar sistemas nacionales que sean obviamente domésticos hoy en día, pero que sean alineados y compatibles con una integración en el futuro. Y recordar el papel de los offsets, o sea, de los carbon offset, que es un instrumento que ya se ha utilizado en Latinoamérica mucho con el mecanismo de desarrollo limpio, el Clean Development Mechanism. Ya hay también una canalización voluntaria muy importante y sobre esto se puede construir un mercado siempre más eficiente. Y último punto es que evidentemente estos mecanismos ayudan a la flexibilidad en el mercado del carbono y ayudan a un mercado más eficiente, más líquido. Y con esto, la próxima, siguiente. La dejo aquí para respetar el tiempo y le devuelvo la palabra al moderador para si hay alguna pregunta. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Vamos a pasar a Claudia y al final vamos a hacer las preguntas. Muchas gracias por tan útil presentación. Pasamos a Claudia Schiffer, directora global de Energía y Clima de Dow Química.
Muchas gracias. ¿Me escuchan bien? A ver si tengo el señal bueno. Ok. Buenos días a todos. I'll speak in English. My Spanish, when I talk about climate, is not the best language. It's a pleasure to join you today. Very good comments about what's needed for decarbonization. Very glad to see all those parties together because really collaboration is the path to go. So I would like to start introducing Dow. Maybe not all of you know who we are. Dow is a material science company, and we produce solutions which address many types of climate change and other challenges in the packaging, infrastructure, and also consumer goods. And some examples are, for example, fluids and materials used in solar power generation. We also produce sealants and insulation materials that help in energy efficiency in building and construction, lightweight materials, and others. So let me start. The next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, I would like to share with you our plans and a recent announcement we made last year on sustainability goals, in addition to our 2025 sustainability program. And we basically, we reinforced our commitment with climate protection, with stop the waste and close the loop. In climate protection, we committed to reduce emissions by 5 million tons by 2030. And this is quite challenging because we are a hard to decarbonize industry. And we also committed with carbon neutrality by 2050. So next slide, to share with you our path to decarbonization. Next slide. Okay, so how do we achieve that? And we have been hearing how difficult it is, and that we need new technologies, we need innovation. So we start with continued optimization of our processes. We have been doing that for the past 30 years, but there are always other things we can do. We are increasing our renewable use, and whenever it's cost competitive, And Dow is today the largest chemical company globally in renewable power purchase. But we really, long-term, to really decarbonize, we'll need to invest in step change technologies. This will take time. We have today a JV, this is one example, we have many others, but we have a JV with Shell where we are developing electrified cracking, which is a possible route for decarbonization in our industry. We have also other catalytic processes being developed, which would decrease significantly energy use. But we will need mitigation and transitioning technologies, as we've heard, removals. Carbon capture and storage is an area we are looking at, and blue hydrogen. And we have currently collaboration in a coalition in the Netherlands with other industries, with governments, to really understand our options and how we scale up infrastructure and go implement CCS and carbon capture in this area. And another also very important piece is our continuous investment in innovation, because the chemical industry contributes with materials which are critical in this process. So we want to continue to invest there and help decarbonize our value chains. So next slide, please. And the path ahead is basically what we've heard here, right? We know that we will need a lot of investments, we need innovation, and we cannot make it alone. So it's really everything we've heard here. It's public-private partnerships. It's good regulation, stable, the right pricing signals, so we can really advance towards that, because it's also about affordability, risk reward, so we can attract the investments. Because we as companies, we need also to deliver returns to our investors. So we need to find a way to do this. And we also need that society recognizes that this transitioning has a cost, right? We all need to be part of this transitioning really to make it happen. So I would like then now to talk about Latin America, because that's the focus today. We have been present in Latin America for the past 60 years. We have 14 manufacturing sites, and we have offices in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina. And we believe that Latin America has great advantages in the low carbon economy because of the abundant and cost competitive natural resources. So we have good projects and programs which can help economies, can help communities, and also for us can help our positioning in low carbon operations and low carbon products. So let me share with you 2 examples of what we are doing. So next slide, please. So the first example is a solar power deal we closed for our Aratu site. This is in Brazil. And this site already consumes 75% of renewable power and energy. We have also biomass steam. And with this solar deal, we become 100% renewable power. And I think here the major message is that we have other stacks beyond carbon when we do renewable power. In this case, we are also helping with job generation and gender inclusion beyond the climate benefits. So next slide, please. The second example is related to supply chain engagement with best practices and forest preservation in another site in Brazil, in Rio Branco. And this is, so it's really when you are in a forestry chain, it's very important that you are responsible and that you drive the right regulatory behavior through contracts that reinforce the commitment of our suppliers and contractors. 100% of our charcoal are from FSC certified forests, and this is aligned with the best international standards. And also, we own 40% of the native forests in Rio Branco, and we take it very seriously to preserve it. And this contributes with biodiversity conservation besides carbon storage. So in summary, that's what I wanted to share with you. I wanted to emphasize that we do believe that decarbonization is the path to go. It's possible with collaboration. It's very challenging as well, but it's doable. We need the right instruments in place, which is the collaboration, carbon pricing, climate policies that do not contribute to generating confusions between implicit and explicit carbon pricing, because this ends up driving instability in the view of which is going to be your future carbon pricing. And we do believe that Latin America is really very well positioned for a low carbon economy, contributing with economies, with the communities, and also with the environment. So thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Ligia.
Muchísimas gracias, Claudia. Muy oportuna también, muy útil para nuestros países de América Latina. Ahora les presento a Michael Korkinski, presidente de Wildlife World Carbon. Adelante.
Good morning, Ligia and everybody. I am Mike Korchinski, the president of Wildlife Works. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, USAID, for organizing this event. And if you could put my presentation up, I'm seeing here we go. Thank you very much. My slides are in Spanish in case anybody wants to read along, but I will be speaking in English today. So you can move to the next slide, please. So just a brief introduction of who Wildlife Works is. We're a global leader in conservation. We are unique in the sense that all of our conservation activity worldwide is funded through market activity, and in particular, the REDD+ market. So we are effectively a global specialist in how to implement REDD+ to stop deforestation. So that's all we do as a company in all the countries in which we work. We came to Colombia. I should say we've been around for about 24 years. So we've been doing this for 24 years around the world, started in Africa. We came to Colombia in 2018 as the private sector partner to implement the BioRED program that you've heard about, that USAID brought to Colombia with Minambiente, the Ministry of Environment in Colombia. And we've been working with 8 communities in both Afro-Colombian communities and indigenous community in the Pacific region of Colombia for the last 3 years, as helping them to implement this transition to forest protection model versus a forest exploitation model. And we are about to invest, or we are in the middle of investing, about $5 million US in new projects. That is all private sector funding from the US in new Colombian projects. And that is as a result of these initiatives that you've heard of, that the Colombian government has taken over the past 5 years in creating the best framework, frankly, in the world for REDD+ regulation. And so that's attracted investment to develop more projects. It could attract still much more investment in the future. Globally, as a company, we are managing over $1 billion in private sector financing flowing into REDD projects around the world. Next slide, please. So I think we all understand the need. Many people have spoken of the urgent need for reductions in emissions, and have spoken about how that urgent need creates a great opportunity. And I think the same is true in the forest sector and in conservation, which is where we operate. So we all agree on the goal. The goal is to achieve, broadly achieve the NDC commitments of Latin American countries through, in our case, reducing dramatically the rates of deforestation. We strongly believe we won't achieve carbon neutrality in the agricultural and forestry sector without stopping deforestation. We can't reforest our way out of this problem if we can't stop deforestation. So our focus is entirely on stopping deforestation, working with communities. But the other goal we hope to achieve is a dramatic impact on the SDGs, or ODS as they are in Spanish. And what that means really should mean a reduction, a dramatic reduction in loss of biodiversity. As you protect the forest and the habitat, you protect the species that live there. And also a dramatic improvement in livelihoods for forest communities. When we talk about the global challenge to reduce emissions by stopping deforestation, we need to remember there are billions of people living in forests around the world. And those people need to find new ways of living in order to protect the forests that they call home. But overall, the goal, we believe, is to reduce at least 2 billion tons of emissions from deforestation. Now, that if we can do that, and if the market can support that, then we feel that there's an opportunity to achieve the broader goals that we've discussed. Next slide, please. So we all agree on the goal, but we don't all agree on the path. And this is one of my key messages, is all paths lead to the same goal. All paths that aim for the same goal should be followed at this point. We don't have time to compete for paths to the goal. And so just as an example of that, in our sphere of operation in the area of REDD+, many people are in discussions all over the world about the evolution of REDD+ towards national and subnational programs, and away from project activities such as the ones that are have been described under the BioRED program in USAID. And so people talk about these things as alternatives, and they each have their strengths and weaknesses, it's true. So national programs and subnational programs, which clearly are the goal to support those national programs through success, they are very good at policy and enforcement. They're not so good at localizing initiative and incentive for individual communities and forest communities. Projects have the opposite strengths and weaknesses. Projects are not so good at policy and enforcement, shouldn't be their job, should be the government's job, but they're very good at localizing incentive and working specifically with local drivers of deforestation to aid communities in that transition process. So while some people see this as alternatives, next slide, please. At Wildlife Works, we really see these as complementary activities, that the right solution, we believe, for national governments is a solution that combines the strengths of both approaches to mitigate the weaknesses of both. You may notice it's no accident that the strengths of one approach are the weaknesses of the other approach. And we feel strongly that governments that can find a way to combine those two approaches, the strengths of government programs and policy, and the strengths of private sector localized initiatives and incentives, will be the ones that succeed in reducing deforestation most successfully. So that's an example of where there's discussion about paths that we think is counterproductive, that we feel that it should be a complementary set of solutions rather than an alternative set. Another example of that would be this question of removals versus offsets. So the notion here is that, for those that aren't so familiar, the discussion about removals is growing new trees to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, versus protecting existing trees, avoiding the deforestation of existing trees. Again, we don't think that should be an either or. Both are essential for us to achieve the target. We need to invest in stopping deforestation, and we need to invest in reforestation activities. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that illustrates just one detail that we think that countries need to think about as they move forward in order to be able to take advantage of this complementary solution. And this graph is maybe familiar to some on this presentation. It's a graph produced by the government of Colombia in their submission under the UNFCCC for their forest reference level. So the black line is the historical emissions associated with deforestation. It's actually a deforestation graph. And then the purple line and the area under is the government's view of what would happen without the right level of financial investment and support in stopping deforestation. So that's their projection of what would happen into the future. The idea here is that the market can support the achievement of reductions of those of that deforestation. But importantly, there are two kinds of market that are out there. There's a voluntary market, which is made up of all those companies that are not regulated for their carbon emissions. And those companies that just want to do the right thing by contributing to climate mitigation globally. And then there's the compliance markets, or the regulatory markets, which require reductions by companies and which will allow, in some cases, companies to mitigate their obligation by offsetting the carbon footprint with credits from the market. So those two markets act differently, and they set targets differently in some cases. So that dotted line that you see running across the middle there, horizontally, represents the historical average of Colombia's emissions. So it represents an average. And in the voluntary market, the opportunity is to finance the reductions from where Colombia is now and where it's going down to that average and beyond. Whereas in some of the compliance markets, they won't begin financing performance until the performance has reached that historical average. So again, this illustrates why these cannot be contradictory approaches. They need to be complementary approaches so that governments have the full range of financing options and the full range of market options to allow them to achieve that success. And if that isn't the case, so if you could go to the next slide, please. So there is one particular standard out there that's available to countries that it sets up this conflict because it requires that any performance that is supported from in the green arrow there, you can see from the current level of emissions of a country down to their average, if the market is used to finance that performance, then that performance has to be deducted from the average target before any reward can be made under the jurisdictional program. So that sets up an either-or choice for governments, which we feel is an unnecessary choice and an unhelpful choice for most governments. Most governments, I say, especially where there's a rising emission profile historically, which sadly is still the case for many tropical forest countries and certainly the large forest countries. So this environment requires some knowledge, some expertise to navigate, but importantly, the goal, in our opinion, should be to achieve this level of reduction supported by the market, both voluntary and compliance, because we believe the voluntary market will remain very healthy and is growing very quickly. But the second most important thing about this combination of national program and projects is, the next slide, please. Could you move to the next slide? Is the importance for communities, for indigenous communities, for communities of African descent, and for local communities who live in the forests, because the projects allow them to be incentivized to protect their forest. And it doesn't require them to be rewarded. It doesn't hold their rewards until the whole country performs. So it allows for incremental success, community after community after community, towards the national goal. The other approach, the either-or approach, requires a national goal to be achieved before anybody can be rewarded for their performance. And that, in our opinion, is not the right model. Now, Colombia, in their leadership, has the best legislation in the world, the best framework in the world to support this combined effort of projects working in harmony with programs. So there is an example, a real one right here in Colombia, of the framework that you need to be able to reward communities for their own performance, independently of the performance of the state as a whole, but build towards that performance as a state and be rewarded at the national level when you achieve that performance. So, and indigenous communities need their own projects because they're the best to decide on which SDGs are important for them, which ODS or which SDGs are important for them. They know from their livelihood plans what they need. And it's not the same from community to community. And so that kind of specific support for communities is best done, in our opinion, through local action and local incentive. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Gracias, Michael, excelente. Hemos tenido 3 muy buenas presentaciones, se complementan muy bien, entre sí las 3 presentaciones. Espero que todos los participantes la hayan disfrutado tanto como yo. Voy a hacer ahora la primera pregunta y le pediré en el mismo orden que presentaron que puedan contestarla. ¿Cuáles son las oportunidades y desafíos para el uso de los offsets en el sector energético de la región de América Latina?
Hola, gracias por la pregunta. El primer desafío para nosotros para utilizar los offsets es tener una estabilidad del marco regulatorio. O sea, tener de un lado objetivos y senderos de descarbonizaciones claros por parte del gobierno y también una cierta claridad o trayectoria en los instrumentos que se van a utilizar de alguna manera. Impuesto a carbono, emission trading y después offset. De esta manera, de alguna manera, esto es lo que se está planeando ahora, pero para nosotros que tenemos que programar inversiones por décadas, es importante entender cuáles van a ser los instrumentos y cuál va a ser la secuencia y también una idea de la ambición, en manera de también organizar nuestras inversiones compatiblemente con las oportunidades que el marco regulatorio crea. Y este es el desafío. La oportunidad para nosotros es después de tener para nosotros y el sistema, obviamente, costos de transición del sistema más bajos. De alguna manera, esto lo define el gobierno, la política energética. En este contexto, poder usar offset o carbon pricing o un ETS permite llegar a los objetivos, evidentemente, con menor costo para nosotros el sistema y también traer beneficios a los consumidores o a los sectores forestal o a las comunidades, según de cómo se dibujen los offsets. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Anel. A ti, Claudia.
I think offsets, as we heard in the beginning of this presentation, they will be needed, right, in net zero strategies, because it doesn't mean that we'll be able to deliver zero emissions. So it's going to be needed. I think in the region, we have very good opportunities for nature-based solutions offsets, which are needed and tend to be cost competitive compared to others. So that's something we are always looking at. The challenge is that the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't recognize offsets for emissions reduction. So there's lots of uncertainties in that area. They do recognize when these offsets are part. You can use that, but when it's out of your value chain, is not. I think offsets market, the voluntary market, it's still very uncertain. We don't know how the Article 6 will evolve, and we don't know how much this will cost. Those are not fluid markets, so lots of uncertainties on how everything will evolve. And I think RED Plus, for example, it's also lots of questions about how credible they are, right, Mike? That's your area, you know that much more than we do, but there are always lots of questions about the credibility, the permanency, and the leakage, lots of questions about that. So we need to organize ourselves better. We need to have clear frameworks and clear regulatory view. Today is a patchwork. We don't know how things will evolve. And this doesn't help attract investments as we would need.
Gracias, Michael.
Okay. Well, as we live in that world of uncertainty, and we have done for 20 years. And what I would say is that some of that uncertainty is real, historically for sure. What we're seeing now is that many of the arguments that people use to claim uncertainty or to suggest that there's issues with REDD+ are very old arguments, and many of those problems were solved through the best practice of standards years ago. So the leading standards today solve the issues of permanence and leakage very well as any other sector. And so those are historical arguments that aren't relevant today. What we see today is that the voluntary market, while it was slow to develop in the beginning, when companies were not required to mitigate their footprints, then why would they? And no company was required when compliance markets didn't exist. But now what we see is, now that the marketplace is waking up to the urgency of climate change for their own business, there's honestly a tsunami of interest from the private sector in REDD+. We haven't seen anything like this in 20 years of the interest in supporting REDD+. And why it makes sense for corporates to support REDD+ is the SDG impact, the ODS impact that comes along with it. Corporates want to tell good stories about the way that they are helping to mitigate climate change. And yes, of course, they have to reduce all the emissions they can reduce first, no question. But almost every company will still have unavoidable emissions. So the question is, what do they do with those unavoidable emissions? Do they ignore them, or do they compensate them by supporting avoided deforestation or other projects that generate offsets? And this term offset is used often as some hypothetical thing, but in the forestry sector, an offset is one very rigorously scientifically proven ton of reductions from stopping deforestation. So we should remember that. And the other thing that the corporates like is the communities. They love to be able to point to a place on Earth where they're helping to support a community through this transition and helping to support biodiversity in a very specific place. So I think offsets have a long future. We're seeing an enormous growth in interest. And really, frankly, the supply is the challenge now. How do we ramp up the investment in protecting forests globally?
Muchísimas gracias, de acuerdo totalmente. Yo creo que sí, que es un muy buen momento, precisamente porque estamos tratando de que también se pueda cerrar la negociación del artículo 6 en el marco del Acuerdo de París, justamente para que se pueda fortalecer el tema de los precios al carbono y del mercado, pero los países, si bien están trabajando en que podamos lograr ese acuerdo y cerrar el artículo 6, igualmente, simultáneamente, nos estamos preparando en las políticas y en las normativas necesarias para un mercado voluntario que se pueda también realizar en nuestros países. Así que estamos trabajando simultáneamente allí. En la segunda pregunta que les pasaría a los panelistas es: ¿cuáles son las lecciones aprendidas de Estados Unidos que deben tener en cuenta los países de América Latina para avanzar en los mecanismos de precio de carbono?
Hola, gracias, Ligia. Yo voy a contar más las experiencias europeas, ya que estuve trabajando como italiano, italo-argentino en Enel, y estaba en el gobierno participando a la construcción del sistema europeo de cupos transables, el EU Emission Trading Scheme, y que nombré antes, y simplificando mucho, yo diría que hay tres lecciones importantes. La primera, que el sistema en Europa se ha planeado con una mirada a largo plazo, o sea, con un instrumento que iba a seguir existiendo hasta descarbonización total, pero se ha hecho de manera gradual, a pasos, obviamente con una fase piloto más soft, con menores costos para las empresas, y de alguna manera, después hicieron varias etapas mejorando y corrigiendo el sistema. Entonces, esa planeación de largo plazo, que da seguridad a los mercados, pero da pasos sucesivos mejorando el sistema, fue muy importante. La segunda lección es que estudiar bien la interacción entre el mercado de carbono con otras políticas. En Europa esto ha pasado no muy bien al comienzo, después mejor. El mercado eléctrico tiene sus reglas, está el carbón, el gas, las renovables, el hidro. Entonces, otras medidas de eficiencia energética renovables tuvieron una interacción con el mercado. Entonces, estaba calculada y considerada, así como los impactos sobre las industrias o los usuarios de energía. Entonces, todos estos impactos e interacciones van consideradas. Y la última, muy importante, en la fase inicial, pero siempre la comunicación, involucrar a los stakeholders y colaborar con el sector privado. Yo hace tiempo estuve en el gobierno, pero ahí aprecié, mientras dibujamos el sistema, qué importante fue trabajar con el sector privado para entender cómo implementar el sistema y cuáles eran las exigencias y los desafíos. Así que estos son los 3 puntos que pondría sobre la mesa. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Claudia.
In the US, is everything still in an early stage, right? I think now with the Biden government, we'll need to see how things will evolve. I think in that area, there are indications that they will start with policies that are that will bring implicit carbon pricing, but not explicit carbon pricing, at least in the beginning. So I think there, what we need is the stability again. And then we need bipartisan agreements, because that will drive some stability on commitments that will be brought forward. So we are watching that, and everybody's learning. We don't know exactly how everything will evolve. And in Europe, where this emissions trade scheme is in place for a long time, I think it's pretty much aligned with Mariano said. There are good learnings on the stability. It started with an expectation of a future market price, and which did not happen. And this doesn't bring the stability for investors and for returns. So we need to find a way on how to fine-tune that. And I start to see articles that there will be now a future carbon pricing that the government would guarantee, and that would bring this stability for people making investments, right? If you get your technology at a certain abatement cost, it makes sense to go invest. What I think is very critical is really to avoid a patchwork of regulations. So better to have less regulations, and because otherwise you start to have all of those interferences, right? For example, you have a carbon pricing, but you have renewables mandates and you have energy efficiency mandates. This will end up giving the wrong signal, because you have a lower demand for the carbon. So how do you balance all of that? I think those are some of the learnings that we need to have moving forward.
Así es. Gracias. Michael.
Well, I think in our world, we see the impact of this instability in pricing in the uncertainty of commitment to communities. If we're asking communities to make long-term change in their livelihoods to address deforestation, it's very difficult to convince them that we're serious, the world is serious about that, when we can't agree on a value that we place on protecting that forest by those communities. So this instability translates into challenges in convincing communities on the ground, working with them to help them move in that direction. I think we're seeing more stability now. I think the ETS was a great example, as has been mentioned. It's a regulatory, we never understood why a regulatory system would allow the price in the market to drop below a price that achieved the regulatory outcome. It's a regulatory system. You know what the minimum price is to achieve the regulatory outcome. Just make that the floor. Doesn't have to be a perfect market. So I think we always wondered why it took so long to fix that problem of supply and demand to get the price where it needed to be. But just to be aware that those prices do matter and the stability of pricing matters, and the long view of pricing matters when you're talking about what value we're placing on protecting forests.
Coincido con ustedes en que estamos ante un gran desafío, pero también estamos ante una gran oportunidad. Por eso celebro mucho esta serie de webinars, en la medida que podamos conocer los buenos ejemplos que tenemos en América Latina y en otras regiones, en la medida incluso no solamente que lo conversen las autoridades, en la medida que podamos conocer algunos videos o en algunos webinars las experiencias propias de comunidades que hablen cómo cambió su vida al conservar el bosque a través de esta estrategia, cómo tienen hoy día una vida digna que les permite solventar todas sus necesidades y que disfrutan realmente lo que están haciendo. Eso va a ser también importante para nuestros países, el conocerlo directamente, la experiencia desde ellos. Estamos en un momento importantísimo porque los tiempos de cambio climático se han acelerado. No solamente el incremento de la temperatura y el cambio global, sino el que el presidente Biden haya tomado las medidas que ha estado tomando y las que ha anunciado. Ha permitido igualmente en la Unión Europea, en Asia, en Inglaterra, que, pues, como decimos en buen panameño, nos estemos poniendo más las pilas, porque los tiempos de la transformación se han acelerado. Yo creo que eso es bueno para nuestros países. Es importante que nos preparemos, que también nos pongamos las pilas para acelerar las transformaciones propias en nuestros países, y estoy convencida que los mercados de carbono nacionales, que luego puedan articularse como un mercado regional. El mercado regional de América Latina se podrá también articular muy bien con el mercado europeo, con el mercado de California o algún otro norteamericano, incluso hasta con el mercado chino o cualquier otro. Pueden articularse. Panamá es un país pequeñito, pero es un país que está muy interconectado. Tenemos una economía de servicios, de logística. Aquí hay representación de transnacionales de todas las regiones del mundo, que antes reducían sus emisiones, pero las registraban en sus casas matrices en sus países y las compensaban en sus países. Hoy día, con la normativa que ya tenemos y con el programa de reducción de huella de carbono, la tienen que registrar en Panamá, la tienen que compensar en Panamá, y podrán el próximo año también hacer esas transacciones de crédito de carbono en el mercado panameño. Así que yo creo que poquito a poquito nuestros países van avanzando, y sesiones como estas van a fortalecer esa colaboración para que podamos continuar y que realmente logremos no solamente nuestros mercados nacionales, sino articular un mercado de carbono regional. Doy las gracias realmente a los organizadores, a USAID, a IETA, a Socarbono y al gobierno de Colombia. Muchísimas gracias. Que estén bien todos.
Carlos